Welcome to the wonderful world of live steam. Today, we're going to visit a very special backyard railroad nestled in the heart of Portola Valley, California. This is the story of a railroad that happened almost by chance as two neighbors and a friend met and discovered their mutual passion for trains. What followed was the construction of one of the most scenic private right-of-ways in California. Join us now as we take an exciting ride on the Flintridge and Portola Valley Railroad. The railroad had humble beginnings. Owners Peter Mosley and Ron Schmidt explain.
My father, Francis Mosley, had 4 3/4-inch gauge railroad around his house in Flintridge, California. And when he died, I ended up with his stuff and had moved it up here in 1984 and let it sit around. And then late in '89, I began to lay a little bit of 1-inch track. And then in 1991, Ron showed up, and he should tell you about how he got the disease.
We were looking for a new house in Portola Valley and settled on the one next door to Peter's house. Independently, we both were sort of train crazies. I bought the house with the idea that I'd maybe put a track in the backyard and try live steam. But no real serious plans. But lo and behold, we soon find out that Peter's building an outdoor railroad.
So that caused Ron to go out and get a lot of 1-inch stuff and encouraged us to go ahead and finish building the 1-inch, which went around our house and came over just onto their property, with ultimately the idea that it would go around all the way into their backyard. But by 1995, I believe it was, Bill Bowler kept hounding us to get involved in a 2.5-inch to the foot scale project to build a locomotive that he and Stan Marshall had started. And I had been putting Bill off, but finally Ron and I went down there to see it, and we decided that maybe that was the basis for getting going.
Seeing this chassis partially started just was too much to resist. Plus the 1-inch we were having problems having our friends ride on them as they were falling off the cars because they were too narrow.
As Jack Systems used to say, we always went out for derail-a-thons because the track was never stable and it was kind of more frustrating than fun. So that's how we began to build the locomotive. We originally started to make 4 of them, and 4 of them were well along, but when we realized, and Ron, who was the expert on this, he looked at them and said, well, this isn't quite right, and that's not quite right, and this isn't quite right. So we went back and said, well, we'll redo this, redo that, and redo the other thing. And before we know it, we were essentially starting the project over.
Well, when the 3 of us got together and discussed this project, actually there were 4 at the time. Ron was the expert on the narrow gauge and on the Denver Rio Grande particular, and obviously on the C-16s. And he had a pretty clear vision of what he thought would be neat locomotives. And he picked 278 for himself right away, and thought that 268 would be a viable one, probably partly because it was still accessible and it could be measured and checked out. And of course the Bumblebee color scheme was one time in its history when it was quite famous, and Ron immediately said, well, somebody should do the Bumblebee.
Someone who likes Caterpillar tractors.
Somebody likes Caterpillar tractors and Caterpillar Tractor Orange, which it almost is, or Caterpillar Yellow, and so I instantly volunteered to do that.
Actually, we persuaded him to do that without him knowing what he was agreeing to, but it worked out fine. In order to document the ones that we'd chosen, they still exist, so we went to Colorado and took lots of pictures, took our tape measures and our notebooks and photographs, and went there 4 or 5 times, just at least every year, to get more and more detail on the engines and find out little things that we tried to model, because we have tried to make them as carefully representative of the prototype as we could. And so it took quite a long time. It took nearly 8 years for us to get the first one up and running. But in the meantime, we'd come to the realization that bigger is better, and had begun to lay the track over here, actually starting at Ron's house, not here, so that Our first track was a track that came up from the driveway in order to allow us to get stuff from a vehicle, an automobile up, or a truck up to where we were ultimately going to be storing them.
As the C-16 projects commenced, the 4 3/4-inch track was taken out and construction on a 7.5-inch gauge track was started in earnest. Together with the track, the engine project continued, and eventually all 3 locomotives were completed.
They moved along more or less in parallel, and we tended to use my engine as the one to sort of see what we were doing, and if it worked on that one, then we go back and do it on the rest of them. So mine was the first to fire up in 2003. So it took a long time to get it going, but even then it was far from being done.
In fact, they're not done.
Yeah, they're never done to our satisfaction even yet, but they all 3 of them run, but that's because Stan Marshall got elderly and had to drop out of the project, and his engine ultimately got sold to Ray Jerem down in Fresno.
Peter Mosley's pre-war 268 was the first locomotive to be finished, then Ron's 278, and finally, in 2009, Bill Baller's immaculate Bumblebee hit the rails. A typical day at the track begins at the engine house and steam bays, with the shunting of engines by a Role Models-built radio-controlled switch engine. The engine, powered by a Kubota tractor motor, is powerful enough for any task it is called to perform.
One of the main reasons we got it is neither one of us are getting any younger, and it's a good engine to actually tow around our steamers and get them in place. And then shunting and just making up trains is another one, and of course it's just a perfectly good train to get out and visitors and quick way to run around, and of course it'll haul anything. It's a very powerful, torquey engine. And then it's very nice to be able to stand away from the locomotive and run it radio control. That is far more satisfactory than we realized that it would be.
The engine is also used to transport visiting equipment from the loading bay to the turntables. Engines to be fired up are shunted onto the turntable and then turned onto one of 2 steaming bays. The C-16s are fired by Pocahontas coal imported from Pennsylvania, as well as Australian char. Steaming up a 2.5-inch scale engine usually takes about 45 minutes. During that time, the engine is oiled, cleaned, and checked for any leaks and other problems. Compressed air, water, and electricity are readily available from Ron's adjacent shop. Once under steam, it is time to head out to the yard to make up a train. Two toots, and we are off. Rolling stock consists of authentic Denver and Rio Grande freight equipment. The railroad is a dog bone layout and contains roughly 2,500 feet of track, including sidings and yards. The main line itself is roughly 1,800 feet. We begin our journey by crossing the impressive curved trestle at the west end of track. The curved trestle gives way to an impressive replica of the Hermosa trestle near Durango, built to scale except for one small difference.
We have this philosophy that if you scale down the prototype, it's going to work. Well, there was a little bit of misgivings about that, so we took one section out of it.
It's built like the prototype, but it is one shorter, although my recollection was we just didn't have room for the extra section. I didn't realize we were worried about its strength. But anyway...
the Case 27 runs over it with no problem.
Yeah.
A generous fill takes the double track behind the center house and out into Peter's backyard. Here is the most scenic vista on the line, a panoramic view of Portola Valley. Crossing yet another bridge, the track proceeds directly onto Peter's back deck and one of the most challenging aspects of the railroad.
Well, the original 1-inch went around back on the back side of the building on part of our house, and it's very narrow, and we had an elevated section in there. But with the 1-inch, it was reasonable to go through there because there's a tree, very large tree that we didn't want to destroy, and it's close to the house. So in that spot, we couldn't backfill and make a fill or anything like that. We had to actually build a kind of a trestle. But we decided that it wouldn't be prototype, it would just have to be something that was effective. And
safe.
And safe. And so when we did that, the 2.5-inch scale just barely fits. I mean, you got to keep your legs in close, and we couldn't see any way out of it short of chopping down a very valuable tree, and we weren't willing to do that.
Directly following the Narrows is Peter's engine house and the old east end of the railroad, where engines used to be turned. nowadays, the trains can sail straight up the curve to the driveway. The driveway bridge is removable, an ingenious invention by Peter Moseley.
The other thing that was a little bit challenging was getting across my driveway, because we'd had some very light aluminum pieces that allowed us to drop in place before the 4 3/4 inch gauge track, and they were easy to handle. But now we wanted something that would support a several thousand-pound engine, but also be transportable. So I thought about it quite a while and finally figured out the scheme that you'll be able to see on the tape, which involves 2 panels that are essentially like little flat cars. You roll one out and drop it in place, and then roll the other one over it and drop it in place, and now you've got a continuous bridge across the driveway with a portable center support. So that worked out, but that was a lot of work to build that.
Voila, a driveway bridge.
Passing in front of Peter's house, the railroad then completes the east loop by passing through what was once a tennis court.
The other challenge was your tennis court.
Oh yeah, well there was a challenge with the tennis court. Where we're sitting right now used to be a tennis court, and we had dreams of coming through here, but there was a certain amount of domestic resistance to that, and it took a while to wear down my wife to where we were able to.
But she was very gracious.
She was gracious about it, and it looks better now anyway, and it's used a lot more than it was. But so getting that through here was more of a political difficulty than it was an actual physical difficulty of building it.
But it was an important change because that allows for continuous running.
That's right. Very.
Before we had return loop to turntable and turn around.
That's right. So that's made a huge difference in the operation.
After that, the journey returns you to the main yards and an authentic functioning replica of the Jack's Cabin water tank. The tank was started by Ken Johnson and completed by Peter and Ron. The C-16s aren't the only motive power on the railroad. Ron had Rich Ulen of Ulen Locomotive Works custom build a K-27. The mighty locomotive is almost too big for the curves, so it spends most of its time running at other tracks. Here is a rare outing of the K-27 at the Flintridge and Portola Valley with Peter Moseley's wreck train in tow. Goose 6 was built by Jack Sessoms. Electrically operated, the Goose comes complete with sound effects and is easy to run. Ron commissioned RMI to build their first number 50 diesel switcher. Along with the larger number 1, it serves yard duty as well as casual mainline service. We hope you have enjoyed your day on the Flintridge and Portola Valley Railroad. We bid you farewell as we leave you with some unforgettable scenes of railroading. Until next time, this has been a Mike Massey production.